present you today briefly Mr. Jim Epstein, our guest tonight. We are few but valuable, and he has very interesting things to say. Let me say a few words about him. He joined Barron's in February 1992 as commodities editor, where he was the first to write an economic beat. He also wrote a book, a very interesting book, Econospin, How to Read Between the Lines When the Media Manipulates the Numbers. Still available if you're interested, both in print and in a Kindle edition. Another interesting thing, before joining Barron's, he worked for 13 years at the New York Stock Exchange as a senior economist. He also taught at the City University of New York and St. John's University, and holds an MA in economics from the New School and a Bachelor of Arts in History from Brandeis University. He has appeared numerous times on Fox, CNBC, BBC, and other important networks. When I think of Mr. Jim Epstein, I'm impressed by the fact that I can meet someone who met Murray Rothbard and Noam Chomsky, among others, and who used to speak to the phone as if with a friend, with Milton Friedman, and many others that you might have heard. So, without any further ado, let's meet the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a privilege to be here and to be speaking before you. As was mentioned, I have been indeed deeply influenced by disparate sources, including Noam Chomsky, including Murray Rothbard, and including Milton Friedman. I want to place before you today a review, a sort of overview of various thinkers, and in a way, my message, I guess, will be that the emperor has no clothes, meaning that so many people who are prominent in economics are really purveying fraudulent ideas. It's really the sort of thing I learned from Noam Chomsky when I was about your age. Noam Chomsky, during the Vietnam War, published a book of essays called American Power and the New Mandarins. And the New Mandarins that he spoke of were professors, academicians, very prestigious people from Harvard and MIT. And he had no professional expertise in foreign policy issues, but he was able to expose the fact they were in the service of power. And indeed, my view, shaped by Noam Chomsky, has been that too many economists are shaped by two things that warp their thinking. One of them is the idea that economics is a branch of physics, a branch of mathematics. And while, of course, you can use arithmetic to figure out certain concepts in economics, truthfully, economics is about human action. It's about action in markets, and all of the real truths of economics are graspable by somebody who knows nothing of math. I use the word human action because some of you may know that that's the title of a book by Ludwig von Mises, Human Action, and the human action, of course, shaped the thinking of somebody like Murray Rothbard. I mean, the second problem with mainstream economists is that they are enthralled to the opportunity to sit at the tables of power. Imagine you're Alan Greenspan, and you don't even have a PhD in economics, but you manage to make your way through the labyrinth of Washington, D.C. politics, and you become chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Then you become chairman of the Federal Reserve. That is extremely seductive. Suddenly the world is at your feet. Who cares about truth? Who cares about being an intellectual when the heavy attraction of power goes to your head and shapes your thinking? And so many mainstream economists, I believe, are attracted to the idea that they can eventually rise to the tables of power. And that power-hungry attitude, I believe, warps their thinking. And although despite that, some of them do come up with some good ideas occasionally. It's not that they're a total loss. I mean, that's a surprise that despite their handicaps, some of them are bright enough to say some intelligent things. Well, this is my overview introduction to a series of names. I have a long title in my talk, as you can see: Thomas Piketty and the Nobelists, why Nobel laureate economists Paul Krugman, Joseph Stiglitz, and Robert Solow all raved about Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, and what that tells us about capitalism in the 21st century, what indeed that tells us about Krugman, Stiglitz, and Solow. Paul Krugman, who you may have heard of, was on a cable TV show, and the reporter jocularly asked him in a humorous way, when people criticize you, Professor Krugman, don't you occasionally say, well, look, I won the Nobel Prize in economics, so how can people criticize? Why don't you just pull rank on them? Say you're a Nobel Prize winner, they have no right to criticize you. Krugman, going along with the joke a little bit, said, well, the problem with doing that is that some of the economists who won the Nobel Prize are idiots. Well, the reporter then asked him, could you name some of those idiots? And Krugman, I would have asked, could you name some of those idiots, not including yourself? But Krugman then said, no, I can't name any of those people there. And of course, that's frequently what academicians do. They have a sort of a delicate minuet, they're polite to each other. And so he didn't want to name some of those idiots. So at least, however, Krugman at least made us open to the possibility that some idiotic things come out of Nobel Prize winners. Now, I'm going to focus on Thomas Piketty's book. He has not, I would say, yet won the Nobel Prize. I suspect he will, but I want to expose the fraud at the core of Thomas Piketty's book. And I really do mean fraud, and I will get to that eventually, but be prepared for something I believe that you would find somewhat shocking. Well, change slides. I'm going to start with the old Woody Allen joke. You may have heard of him, Jewish comic. I took a course in speed reading, learning to read straight down the middle of the page, and I was able to go through War and Peace in 20 minutes. It's about Russia. What he meant, of course, is that when you speed read, you're not exactly going to get the point. Piketty's book has been listed in a jocular article as the most unread book, along with probably Das Kapital and the General Theory of Das Kapital by Karl Marx and the General Theory by John Maynard Keynes. There was a jocular Wall Street Journal article that read, the contest isn't even close. Mr. Piketty's book is almost 700 pages long, and the last of the top 5 popular highlights appears on page 26. Stephen Hawking is off the hook. From now on, this measure should be known as the Piketty Index. Well, perhaps if you're familiar with the Kindle edition of a book, you can highlight certain passages. Now, I have to say that I read Piketty's book, every page of it. I read, in fact, certain pages several times. I marked certain passages, so I was an exception. But the research apparently showed that the highlights just stopped at page 26 for the vast majority of readers, which indicated sort of quasi-scientific evidence that virtually nobody got past page 26. But I will say, however, that when books are as prestigious as Thomas Piketty's, and when they are not read, you were having me again, yes, okay, good, okay. And when they're not read, they become especially dangerous, because then you can say almost anything about what's in the book, anything about the ideas in the book. What is the book about? Well, in case you have not got past page 26, or in case you haven't read it, the book is about the following: that capitalism leads to ever-widening inequality in income and wealth, and that this must be curbed by heavy taxes on those who are rich in income and wealth. That's the basic idea of the book. Now, my two-part presentation, same slides, will be philosophy laced. This is my presentation, what you're about to hear. Philosophy laced with economics. Drawing on the work of another Nobel laureate economist, F.A. Hayek, I will ask, even if Piketty is right, why should we care? Why should we care? And that's philosophical. But then I would answer my own question by saying that under free market capitalism we shouldn't care, but only under crony capitalism should we care. But then heavy taxes on the rich are not the solution. That's going to be my basic statement philosophically, but then I will have a second part of the presentation, which will be that economics laced with sociology. Is Piketty right about what he says? And this is where we'll get to the basic problem with the book. I want to put in your own mind a certain thought. Two interesting anecdotes. You may have heard of John Maynard Keynes' book, The General Theory. And one of the most revealing things Keynes wrote about his own book was in the German edition. The German edition was published in 1938, and it was translated into German, and it's only over the last number of years that people have unearthed what Keynes wrote. At the time, in 1938, when it was published in Hitler's Germany, Keynes wrote specifically that the ideas in the book are most appropriate to a totalitarian society. Much less appropriate to British capitalism, which has a measure of laissez-faire. Well, this was a man saying about his own book that it works ideally under totalitarianism. That's what Keynes said about his own book. Now, Piketty has not said this about his own book, but now imagine that Karl Marx were to write an introduction to his own book, Das Kapital, and he were to say, the ideas of this book do not apply to British capitalism. Imagine that Karl Marx had said, the ideas do not apply to British capitalism. You would have said, this book is called Das Kapital, and it does not apply to British capitalism. How could that possibly be? I mean, British capitalism is the capitalism. Well, what I'm going to show is that what Piketty has said in his own book is that the ideas do not apply to the United States. That's what Piketty specifically said. The ideas do not apply to the United States. But that's anticipated. That's what's to come. Now, let's get back to the philosophical. Hope nobody's injured in the back. Only a couple of broken bones. Okay. Let's get back to the philosophical question about inequality. This is from a quote from the Constitution of Liberty by F.I. Hayek. He wrote as follows: I have no respect for the passion for equality, which seems to me merely idealizing envy. What does Hayek say about liberty versus equality? Not only has liberty nothing to do with any sort of equality, but it is even bound to reduce inequality in many respects. This is the necessary result and part of the justification of individual liberty. If the result of individual liberty did not demonstrate that some manners of living are more successful than others, much of the case for it would vanish. So again, what he's beginning to say is that if you believe in liberty, it's a little bit difficult to also believe in equality, because we know that, as I could say, I'm not going to make it on the professional basketball team, the professional baseball team. There are many things that all of us know we hold in unequal measure in terms of talent. But now Hayek makes a more precise statement about the market order and what we know as merit. And this is a somewhat shocking statement to many, but I believe that it's worth putting your mind around. He writes, it has been argued persuasively that people will tolerate major inequalities of the material positions only if they believe that the different individuals get what they deserve. The market order, however, does not owe its origins to such beliefs, nor was it originally justified in this manner. Now, that's the shock. We like to believe that the market order rewards people according to merit. And so we will accept inequality if there is merit earned by richer people. But Hayek is trying to explain to us that this is a mirage. And that's why his book was called The Mirage of Social Justice. And let's go to the next slide. Yeah. The market order, he goes on to say, could develop when 1,000 years of vain efforts to discover substantively just prices or wages were abandoned And the late schoolmen taught instead that the price is determined by just conduct of the parties in the market, i.e. the competitive prices arrived at without fraud, monopoly, and violence was all that justice required. In other words, we're just talking not about results, but about process. We don't want fraud, we don't want monopoly and violence. But that's all that justice requires. Now, ask yourself a simple question about Piketty. His book has sold in millions of copies. I believe the book is absolutely without merit. I would also say that, my God, on top of that, those who bought the book wasted their money because most of them didn't get past page 26. So if Piketty believed in merit, he would give all that money back. Now, obviously, not necessarily, because he probably thinks his book has some merit. But then, who knows, perhaps he would say, well, if you didn't get past page 26, I don't really merit the money. But what are we talking about? This was a capitalist act between consenting adults. Those who bought the book were not in any position to say, if I don't get past 20, there was no money back guarantee if you don't like the book or if you find the book virtually unreadable. That was the deal. The man is a millionaire from his book, and I have no idea. He didn't earn it on merit, he earned it because that's what the market determined. There's no just price, there's no justice. I could say that most of the books on the bestseller list are garbage. That's not my business. If you want to buy those books, that's your privilege. It's your money, it's not mine. It's not something about which I have any right to comment. And Piketty takes his wealth, the money he made from his book, and invests in some very profitable enterprise, and he makes a lot of money from that. That too, that sells its books, that too is not my business. So Piketty, to my mind, is a refutation of his own idea that merit is what earns you a lot of money in the market society. Let's elaborate a little bit on that. You probably have heard of Tom Cruise. Perhaps you've heard of Jack Welch. He was head of General Electric for many years. Hayek reflects, I've never known ordinary people grudge the very high earnings of the boxer, the football idol, or the cinema star. They seem often even to revel vicariously in the display of extreme luxury and waste of such figures compared with those of industrial magnates or tycoons pale. I didn't read that very well. I assume you know what it says. That compared to that, people resent what CEOs earn. But Tom Cruise gets $20 million a picture, or Mike Tyson gets $100 million to box. We sort of enjoy that. We sometimes revel in that. So we have a kind of inconsistent view of these things, even though we might not even like Tom Cruise as an actor. He doesn't always make a lot of money from the movies that he's in. It's not our business. Somebody wants to go see that movie and he's popular, let them do it. They want to make Tom Cruise rich, that's beyond us. That's capitalist acts between consenting adults, which we may not endorse, because we may think his acting is without merit, just as I believe that Piketty's book is without merit. Now let's get to the ticklish question of inherited wealth. As he writes, this again is Hayek, many people who agree that the family is desirable as an instrument for the transmission of morals, taste, and knowledge still question the desirability of the transmission of material property. Similarly, I guess I should tell Piketty that he has a right to that money that he earned from the book that was without merit, but he has no right to give the money to his children. Rather a strange statement on my part. If he wants to, he has the right to invest it, to waste it, to donate it. It's his money. He can give it to his kids if he wants. So again, what right do I have to object to inherited wealth? Now, I should say, I guess, that we all have, within a certain circle, a notion of merit. We have, if you're at a university, did he earn his grade? If you're in a workplace, somebody works hard, and you think, well, he earned it. We do have certain limited ideas about merit that sometimes do apply. But I only suggest to you to consider that on a societal level, when we see people write best-selling books, or when we see people selling cookies or whatever else and making a lot of money from it and persuading people to buy it, it's ridiculous for us to say that that was earned on merit. So that's why we shouldn't necessarily care. Yeah, this is indeed Hayek's statement about that it is probably a misfortune that, especially in the USA, popular writers have defended free enterprise on the ground that it regularly rewards the deserving. It is therefore a real dilemma to what extent we ought to encourage in the young the belief that when they really try, they will succeed, or should rather emphasize that some unworthy will succeed and some unworthy will fail. Life is unfair. People didn't want to buy what you were selling. A comic I like said, I studied philosophy in college, and when I graduated, the philosophy companies were not hiring that year. That not everybody wants to pay for you and your philosophy. Now, why is this an issue? In part because Piketty takes it seriously. This is a quote from Piketty on merit. Our democratic societies rest on a meritocratic worldview, or at any rate, a meritocratic hope, by which I mean a belief in a society in which inequality is based on merit and effort. I guarantee you that Piketty doesn't define what he means by merit, because if he did define it, and if he did pursue his ideas about merit, he would hit a stone wall. Even the idea of effort is a bit dubious. For some people, what they do is effortless. For some other people, it takes a lot of effort. If we were God, we could decide how to allocate money, but even then, even God probably doesn't know, because probably that's the reason why he leaves it to human beings to settle those matters. But Piketty is going after the idea of merit, even though it's empty, even though it means nothing. And then let me again now quote from Hayek, because I think Hayek takes it to a new level when he writes that income shares in a free market are the outcome of a process, the effort of which on particular people was neither intended nor foreseen by anyone when the institutions first appeared. Institutions which were then permitted to continue because it was found that they improved for all or most the prospect of having their needs satisfied. All right, that opens another new issue. For me, as a bleeding heart capitalist, which is what I call myself, free market capitalism is essentially lifting the living standards of the broad masses of people. Okay, so what I'm saying is that inequality is not the issue, because merit is an empty idea. For the most part, it's an empty idea. But I am saying, however, that the free market is still important because it does make everyone better off. Even the poorest do far better on a free market system than do others under any other system. But if that's the case, however, it does not mean that I care about whether, does it diminish me personally to know that Bill Gates has far more money than I have? It doesn't diminish me in the slightest. I'm poverty-stricken compared to Bill Gates. But the real people I care about are the billions of people who live in real poverty, for whom the only hope is free market capitalism, as I would contend. Here I'm quoting from Brookings Institution study that the number of people worldwide living in extreme poverty, defined as living on $1.25 a day or less, was cut in half between 1990 and 2010. I would maintain that has a lot to do with something I lectured about just yesterday, the rise in the Economic Freedom Index, the rise of capitalism, especially the rise of capitalism in China and the rise of capitalism in, to some degree, in India, the two most populous nations on Earth. All right, now let's get to Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman and his statements about Piketty's book. The Piketty Panic was one of his articles about Piketty's book, and he writes as follows. What's really new about Piketty's Capital is the way it demolishes that most cherished of conservative myths, the insistence that we're living in a meritocracy in which great wealth is earned and deserved, but how do you make that defense if the rich derive much of their income not from the work they do, but from the assets they own, and what if great wealth comes increasingly not from enterprise, but from inheritance? There are many ludicrous things about this quote from the Nobel Prize winner. One of the ludicrous things about it is that it has nothing to do with Piketty's book, as we will see. because that's not Piketty's thesis at all. He doesn't talk about such matters, as we will discover in a moment, but more particularly the statement that Kurgman makes, which is that great wealth comes increasingly not from enterprise but from inheritance, is not even empirically true. If you look at the richest people in the Forbes 500, you'll see that for the most part they came from poverty. They came from limited means. Bill Gates is actually good. His father had some money, but his father was not fabulously rich. And if you look at the majority of people in the Forbes 500, look at the real turnover, most of them actually made it on their own in any case. But apart from it, of course, Kurgman is assuming a whole lot of things about capitalism that we presumably repudiate. That if you inherit your money, there's something wrong with you. Well, that's ridiculous. Because, again, if it was earned by Piketty, Piketty has a right to leave it to his kids. And of course, we would ask Kurgman, if some of those Nobel Prize winners are idiots, then do they really deserve the $1 million that they got? That's what you get, by the way, you win the Nobel Prize. You get $1 million. Did they really deserve it? Well, obviously not. So if Kurgman really cares about merit, he might ask himself about some of his own earnings and whether he merits those things, if you're going to get obsessed about merit. But in the final analysis, we just have to fall back on the fact that this was a capitalist act between consenting adults, and if some people want to buy Kurgman's books, then that's their problem, that's their privilege. They can make Kurgman rich from those books, and we can dispense with the idea of merit. Now, let's hear from Joseph Stiglitz, another Nobel Prize winner, about Piketty's book, because this again demonstrates something about the Piketty phenomenon. What is Joseph Stiglitz saying about the book? It's about corporate welfare. And corporate welfare brings up an interesting point. But let's first of all read what Stiglitz says. One stream of the extraordinary discussion set in motion by Thomas Piketty's timely, important book, Capital in the 21st Century, has settled on the idea that violent extremes of wealth and income are inherent to capitalism. This is actually a superficial reading of Mr. Piketty's work, which provides an institutional context for understanding the deepening of inequality over time. Well, so far he says that it's not about the violent extremes of wealth and income. What is it about, according to Stiglitz? Well, that's why we've discovered that Stiglitz writes, our current brand of capitalism is an ersatz capitalism. For proof of this, go back to our response to the Great Recession, where we socialized losses even as we privatized gains. If it is not the inexorable laws of economics that have led to America's Great Divide, what is it? The straightforward answer, our policies and our politics. So corporate welfare increases as we curtail welfare for the poor. Now, whether welfare for the poor was curtailed is another matter, but notice what Stiglitz is saying about Piketty's book, that it's about corporate welfare. Now, what is corporate welfare? Corporate welfare is a situation in which the corporations get subsidies from the government. That's crony capitalism. The corporations don't get their money from selling products to people or selling products to other businesses. They get subsidies. They get welfare, the sugar subsidies, the agricultural subsidies, the bailout of all the great banks in the United States. That's crony capitalism. And I completely agree with Stiglitz, by the way, that that is not capitalism. That's an evil. That's something about which free market people should vigorously object, because it is based upon force and fraud. It is wrong, and it does contribute to inequality. But here's the remarkable thing. It's clear that Stiglitz, who's representing his, having read Piketty's book, didn't even get to page 26. The reason why he didn't even get to page 26 is that there's not a single thing in Piketty's book about corporate welfare. I'll tell you why I know. Because if you have a Kindle edition of the book, then you can do a word search. I put everything in: welfare, crony capitalism, corporate welfare, every different phrase by which you would describe corporate welfare, and I came up with zero. There's not even an offhand reference to this concept in Piketty's book. So what's amazing about the Piketty phenomenon, about the sort of intellectual emptiness of our times as purveyed by a Nobel Prize winner like Stiglitz, is that he takes a book like Piketty's and he makes it into some fantasy of his own about what the book is really about. Well, although in passing, he does raise a question about inequality, having to do with corporate welfare. And indeed, that's something that we should all object to. That's, you know, capitalism, as my Uncle Abe used to call it. He was a socialist, by the way, but I took that term. Why is it a great term? Because it's a contraction for crony capitalism. That's capitalism. And that's when competitive prices and wages are arrived at without fraud, monopoly and violence, restrictive licensure, all kinds of things. If there is fraud, monopoly, and violence, then there is capitalism. Now, monopoly is a broad concept and too big an idea to go into. I would maintain that 95% of what we would call monopoly, indeed 98%, is basically government imposed. But leave that aside for the moment. A larger discussion, we want to raise the question, we could discuss it. But in any case, fraud and violence, that's clearly capitalism, not capitalism. It's not at all a subject of Piketty's book, but it's certainly something that we care about. We who care about the free market care about, and that produces inequality that we all object to. Now, thank you for being ahead of me there. Now I'm going to produce a chart, one of the charts in Piketty's book, income inequality in the United States, which he charts. Difficult to read that side graph, but what's being measured is the share of the top decile, the top 10% of national income, what they were getting. And notice what Piketty is showing, which impresses him, which is that around the late 1920s, economic inequality, income inequality was high. It then fell, and then it rose into the year 2000, into 2008, it rose again. And Hunter Lewis is a guy who wrote a book called Crony Capitalism in America, and he noticed something very interesting about that chart. That chart that shows that inequality was at its height in the late 1920s, and most recently, the last several years around 08, 09. And what does Hunter Lewis says? What caused and characterized these bubble eras? Notice that the bubbles of the night, if you know your history, in the late 1920s, that was the bubble era that led to the Great Depression. If you know your history, 08, 09, that was the bubble era that led to the Great Recession. That's when income inequality was at its height. And Hunter Lewis asked, what caused and characterized these bubble eras? They were principally caused by the US Federal Reserve and other central banks creating far too much new money and debt. They were characterized by an explosion of crony capitalism, as some rich people exploited all the new money, both on Wall Street and through connections with the government in Washington. In other words, inadvertently, without intending to do so, Piketty is providing evidence that crony capitalism is what exacerbates inequality. Not capitalism, but crony capitalism. So even though he mentions nothing about corporate welfare, inadvertently, that's what Piketty exposes in his book, as Hunter Lewis properly points out in his book on crony capitalism. Now, there's a Nobel Prize that we haven't mentioned, and that's Robert Solow. Robert Solow is, again, he won the Nobel Prize for work on technological change, and he raises a question that is philosophical about income distribution. He writes, would you rather live in a society in which the real wage was rising rapidly, but the labor share was falling, or one in which the real wage was stagnating, so the labor share was unchanging? The first is surely better on narrowly economic grounds. You reach your wage, not your share of national income. So again, he's saying that what if wages are rising, but capitalists are getting more money? Now take the second category. Wages are falling, but capitalists are getting less money. So what would you rather have? Well, he answers his own question. He says, there could be, there could be political and social advantages to the second option. He's actually arguing for the second option, that we all get less as long as capitalists get less. If a small class of owners of wealth, and it is small, comes to collect a growing share of the national income, it is likely to dominate the society in other ways as well. This dichotomy need not arise, but it is good to be clear. All right, we raised another question, which is that if a lot of people, even if we get more money, if a lot of people become rich, then they will start dominating society in other ways as well. And we don't want that. Now, clearly we don't want that, but what is the solution? I believe that, next slide, I believe that Solow is making a case for limited government. That instead of taking money out of politics, we should take politics out of money. In other words, if you have a lot of money, you can buy influence in government. But what if there's a limited government? What if there's practically no influence to buy? What if government is a night watchman state and has very little to do? Well, then you're taking politics out of money. Then Piketty's solution, however, to curbing domination by the rich, heavy taxation will only enhance the power of government over money and thus encourage the rule of elites and special interest groups, including, by the way, rule by the majority. So what I want to suggest to you is that if we object to any form of inequality, and if we object to it on the grounds that that means that you can become powerful in Washington, although, you know, the case of Donald Trump, if you've heard of him, has been cited as somewhat ironic, because even though his campaign is financed from his own money, he was practically poverty-stricken compared to Jeb Bush, who had $100 billion backing him and who got nowhere. But that's another matter. Money doesn't always buy you influence in politics, but sometimes it does. And obviously, we could say that Donald Trump, certainly because he's rich, had the ability to finance his own campaign. But still, what if we simply had a limited government and there would be no influence to buy in Washington? Then the rich people would have to do what we all expect them to do, which is, if you want to make money, invest your money wisely. If you want to make money, invest your money wisely in institutions that can sell people goods and services that we want to buy. Continue to serve us rather than serve the state. So take money out of politics rather than taking politics out of money rather than taking money out of politics is what I would suggest. Now, I want to just, for the middle part of this talk, I just want to draw a few conclusions about capitalism in the 21st century. That envy and covetousness are persistent human traits, creating a perennial welcome mat for books about inequality. That advocates of the free market must accept material inequality, but should emphasize that free market capitalism bestows untold riches on everyone. Third, that advocates of free market capitalism should vigorously oppose crapitalism, crony capitalism, which does lead to unjust inequality of income and wealth, since it arises from fraud, monopoly, and violence imposed by the state. But on balance, by the way, mainstream economics, if indeed the Nobel Prize winners are any example of that, is part of the problem, not part of the solution. I want to pause for a moment to ask if anybody has any questions before I proceed with the economics of Piketty's book. Any problems with my philosophy? I'm sure you have many. Any comments, questions, challenges, insults, whatever is on your mind. Anybody? Okay, well, I'll proceed with the next part of my presentation. This is economics laced with sociology. Is Piketty right? Piketty right about inequality in terms of his own thesis? Now, my answer is twofold, and I heard that in parentheses. He's not right unless we make unrealistic and ahistorical assumptions about human nature and free markets. But as Kurgman aptly noticed, this is the odd part, even Piketty scraps his own grand thesis when applied to the US, engaging in what Kurgman himself calls a sort of intellectual sleight of hand. Now, let me first of all do honor to what is supposedly Piketty's argument. And Solow summarizes what he thinks is Piketty's argument. So as I've said, Joseph Stiglitz, I don't think, read even the first page of the book. Robert Solow read some of it. Kurgman probably read all of it, but given his usual dishonesty, is misrepresenting it whenever the occasion suits him. But let's deal with Solow, who read part of it. This is Piketty's main point, he writes, and his new and powerful contribution to an old topic. As long as the rate of return on capital exceeds the rate of growth, the income and wealth of the rich will grow faster than the typical income from work. Well, that's in a formula that the return on capital exceeds the rate of growth. Let's get to the next part. The percentages will probably give you a clearer idea of what he's talking about. Now, assume that capital income rises by 4 to 5% a year, and that growth rises by only 1 to 1.5%. What Piketty is saying is that there's a tendency for capital income to rise faster than wage income. And that if this persists over time, then see the difference between 5% and 1.5% up there? So capital is increasing by 5% and growth is only increasing by 1.5%. So he throws out this mathematics, and then he says that clearly there's a 3.5 to 4% gap between the R percentage and the G percentage. So now if you take a 3% gap and you compound that over time, then this is potentially terrifying. That's Piketty's own words. I don't know what they were in French, but it's potentially terrifying that capitalists can get so much richer than working people can. Now, whatever the merits of that thesis, there is something rather strange about it. But I want to, let me see, do I want to dwell on this? Well, all right, we will talk about it. Let's say that capital, let's take Piketty's thesis seriously for the moment and imagine that capital is growing by 3% and wages are growing by 1 to 2%. How does that apply to actual people? Well, we'd have to assume that those actual people, that the children and grandchildren of successful capitalists are equally brilliant as capitalists. Generationally, there's no regression toward the mean. We have to assume that Bill Gates' children and Bill Gates' grandchildren are all sort of capitalizing on all that capital improvement. And they're all getting that 4% income, and the rest of us, the wage earners, are only getting 1 to 2%, so the gap is potentially terrifying. We even, of course, if we can't assume that, we'll assume that people never die, that wealth is never diluted over time when left to multiple heirs, or further diluted by estate taxes, philanthropy, or changes in market conditions. My point is only that even if we look at numbers and say and show that capital is increasing by 3 to 4 to 5% and wages are increasing to 1 to 2%, the way it applies to actual people is very different. It probably doesn't produce a capitalist class of people for which the gap is potentially terrifying, because people die, money is left. Warren Buffett is leaving all his money because he set up his kids to give them each $1 billion. A lot of money, of course, but that was a small portion of his $80 billion, which he's donating. So it really doesn't happen in terms of people, even if we take Piketty's thesis seriously about capital and income. But indeed, further, that it assumes no change in market conditions. It's not just that people change. It's not just that Bill Gates is not necessarily going to sire children who are even more just as successful as he at business. It's that on the company level, that firms die and firms replace each other. IBM will yield to Apple, Microsoft, and Google. Sears Roebuck will yield to Walmart. General Motors yields to Toyota. Borders Books goes bankrupt. Barnes & Noble has been threatened by Amazon. Piketty might have noticed that his book is not selling at Barnes & Noble, because Barnes & Noble was supposed to be the monopoly along the border that was dominating the book business. Now it's being taken over by Amazon. So there too, the turnover with respect to capital is so great on the company level and on the human level that it becomes a little bit ridiculous to talk about anything being potentially terrifying, even assuming that Piketty's thesis is correct. Now let's get to Piketty's fantasy about capitalism. He actually does assume that it's a system of profit rather than a system of profit and loss. Capital, he writes, is never quiet. It is always risk-oriented and entrepreneurial, at least at its inception. Yet it always tends to transform itself into rents as it accumulates in large enough amounts. That is its vocation, its logical destination. What could be more natural to ask of a capital asset than that it produce a reliable and steady income? That is, in fact, the goal of a perfect capital market, as economists define it. Well, again, I guess he never heard of Barnes & Noble. I guess he never heard of the fact that IBM shrunk in size by 2/3. I guess he seems to believe that once you've established a brand and once you've established a company, then it's a cash cow. You don't have to do anything. It just produces money the way a cow produces milk. Well, that's not the reality of the entrepreneurial capitalist system, but that's Piketty's fantasy, and indeed, he's talking about a perfect capital market as economists define it. Well, that's a sheer delusion about the capitalist economy, but this at least is consistent with his view that this fantasy that entrepreneurship is only occurs when a company is in its youth. That when a company becomes mature, then you just sit back and like it. Well, that's true about the crony capitalist system, and indeed, Piketty comes from France, and maybe that's the kind of economy he's used to. I don't know. I mean, because clearly, of course, if you have friends in government, then you can keep your business going for many years, whether consumers like you or not. But certainly in the entrepreneurial system, there is an immense amount of advance and retreat. It's not at all the way Piketty describes it. It's clearly that while he grants it, never quite, but he points out, he seems to believe that rents, that if you like, rents are what eventually result once your business is established. Again, a sheer fantasy. Now, what we've set up so far is the bogus assumption that we can take Piketty even slightly seriously. By slightly seriously, I mean that we can at least grant he's got a thesis, however misguided, that he applies, and that he's mistaken in his belief. Because again, it doesn't apply to the real world of human beings and the real world of entrepreneurial capitalism. But this is the odd part and the fraud at the core of Piketty's book, which, interestingly enough, Paul Kurgman did notice. Now remember that Kurgman was originally saying that Piketty's book is about inheritance and all the rest, and Piketty patent. Now, in a review that he wrote about this book, Kurgman writes something very different. He writes that there was one thing that slightly detracts from the achievement of Piketty, a sort of intellectual sleight of hand, albeit one that doesn't actually involve any deception or malfeasance on Piketty's part. Well, the reason it doesn't involve any deception is because it's obvious in the book. But certainly the deception is there, as I'll explain. Kurgman writes, still here it is. The main reason there has been a hankering for a book like this is the rise, not just of the 1%, but specifically of the American 1%. Yet that rise, it turns out, has happened for reasons that lie beyond the scope of Piketty's grand thesis. In other words, what Piketty is talking about clearly is the US. That's his principal bête noire. That's where inequality has occurred. And as I said, imagine that Karl Marx were to have written that the inequality that his thesis does not apply to British capitalism. Piketty now writes, I can quote from Piketty, that because Kurgman is absolutely right about the sleight of hand, that Piketty writes in a section called The Causes of Rising Inequality in the United States, that the following. The increase, he says, he writes, was largely a result of an unprecedented increase in wage inequality, and in particular, the emergence of the extremely high remunerations at the summit of the wage hierarchy, particularly among top managers of large firms. Now, I heard Piketty be interviewed on a podcast that I respect, and I was astonished that the interviewer was not stunned by Piketty's admission. This book is called Capitalism in the 21st Century. It's supposed to be about capital income. It's supposed to be about what we just described, which is the divergence between capital income and wage income. But Piketty is specifically writing what Kurgman himself admits is an intellectual sleight of hand, that when you apply it to the US, it doesn't apply at all. That the causes of rising inequality in the United States have nothing to do with capital. Notice he's saying the increase was largely the result of an unprecedented increase in wage inequality. Suddenly the book is not at all about capital in the 21st century. The book is about CEO salaries. The book is about the fact that chief executive officers get paid too much. It's not about capital inequality, it's about wage inequality. Again, if Piketty could not apply his thesis, even on his own terms, even from his own perception, to the US economy, the capitalist economy of the 21st century, then why should we bother with his thesis? Why should we get past page 26 of his book? Why should we imagine he's actually writing about capitalism? He's writing about people getting paid too much. Now, one of the obvious things we can say about this is that even if he's right that the CEOs are getting paid too much, then it's no longer potentially terrifying. That was his phrase, that it's potentially terrifying. Why isn't it potentially terrifying? Because the median CEO tenure has been variously estimated at 6 to 10 years. We no longer have to go into the whole argument about what happens to capitalism, what happens to the returns on capital. That could be potentially terrifying, because a CEO, they have their moment in the sun. If they're heading a big corporation, they become quite rich. They eventually get on the boards of directors. They do quite well. We don't have to worry about these people at all. But we do at least have to say there's nothing potentially terrifying about these high salaries. They're not capitalism run amok. They're just highly paid CEOs, maybe too highly paid. But there's nothing potentially terrifying about that. So his thesis falls apart. But let's at least let's deal with Piketty's own thesis, because again, it's old wine in new bottles. It's the idea that CEOs are paid too much. Now, why are they paid too much? He brings out the standard idea that the corruption at the top, the unholy alliance between executives and the paymasters. He writes, at the very highest levels, salaries are set by the executives themselves or by corporate compensation committees whose members earn comparable salaries, such as senior executives at other large corporations. It's a very standard idea that the people who serve on the compensation committees of the corporations are your friends, and since they're your friends, they'll pay you. You'll scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You serve on my compensation committee, and you'll pay me. And so on. This corruption at the top means that they get paid these tens of millions of dollars. They get stock options, and it's a terrible thing. We therefore should object to it because it's clearly a part of corruption, of a form of cronyism. And that's what he says. But this is something interesting about the thesis and where it falls apart in another way. Piketty actually does address a question about the corruption at the top with respect to these CEO salaries, which I must partially commend him, because he realizes that if you're going to posit this thesis about compensation committees and all this cronyism, and I'll scratch your back and you'll scratch mine, then he asks this question is, why didn't it occur prior to 1980? Why is it that the rise, that all this explosion in CEO salaries started to occur in the 1980s and 1990s? Why didn't it occur in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s? Why weren't all these cronies paying each other ridiculous salaries then? What happened? Did they suddenly get to know each other in country clubs and not know each other prior to this? Well, he gives a very odd response. He says that the reason was the high marginal tax rate. He says that he writes, I'll read this to you, the very large decrease in the top marginal income tax rate in the English-speaking countries after 1980 seems to have totally transformed the way top executive pay is set, since top executives now have much stronger incentives than in the past to seek large raises. So what is he saying, which is very funny? He's saying this, that prior to 1980, the top marginal tax rate was 70%. I should tell you, by the way, that 70% was really not, there were so many deductions and so many tax shelters, nobody really paid 70%. But let's take him at his word. The top marginal tax rate was 70%. So you only got 30 cents of each dollar, according to him, of your salary. And then the marginal tax rate fell to 29, 28%, and now it's at 31%, so it fell substantially. So what he's saying, which is a very odd idea, he's saying that when the marginal tax rate was 70%, nobody had any incentive to form these cabals, these conspiracies, that there was no corruption at the top, because after all, you could only get 30 cents on the dollar. It's a very odd kind of argument about the incentives of marginal tax rates. Oh my God, you would have said, well, I only get 30 cents on the dollar, but an extra million will be 300,000, an extra 2 million will be 600,000. It's a very odd argument to make that CEOs would have no, and it's effortless too. You just ask your friends to give you an extra few $1 million, because after all, that's what is supposedly happening. So it sort of defies belief that it was because of the marginal tax rates falling that suddenly, oh, now I'm going to get 70 cents on the dollar, now we'll get corrupt. Well, very odd. that this could be the case. But in any case, I will tell you, by the way, there's no evidence that very many of them, certainly not CEOs who got good accounting advice, actually paid 70% in any case prior to 1980. But even taking him at his word, it sort of defies belief that it's the case. Well, the truth is that we can explain why CEOs are getting such ridiculously high salaries, and by the way, we can explain it without necessarily saying that they merit any of this money. We don't know. I mean, if they're selling something that we are not interested in buying, how could they possibly merit it? The product has no merit for us. But in any case, let's talk about, I'm drawing this from an article called The Real Story Behind Executive Pay, and the key point that's been made by this author of this article, Stephen Kaplan, is as follows, that private company executives have done even better than public company executives since 1979, the time when pay at the top picked up. So private company is what we're talking about. We're talking about private corporations that are basically owned and controlled by their shareholders. And they have no incentive to pay CEOs any more than they have to. There's no cronyism there, there's no board of directors and public ownership. And they pay just as well, if not better. So they obviously don't want to pay any more than they have to, so why do they? Well, they probably do because the best explanation for exploding CEO pay is really the same explanation for the higher pay of Tom Cruise or of others, that the U.S. companies are operating in a much larger global marketplace in which stakes are much higher than ever before to find the right person. Movies are shown all over the world. There's clearly a distinct premium if you have 1 billion customers, or if you have 1 billion people who can see your movie. Then there's a huge premium on finding the right talent. I might personally regard it as, there was a very good cynical essay written by a professor at Harvard Business School about the rise of the charismatic CEO. Or indeed the charismatic actor, the star system, the tendency to believe that one person can make all the difference. You and I might regard this as somewhat ridiculous. But if that's what they want to do, maybe they're right. Maybe there are indeed these very special people who are, if you're 1% better than the other person, then that 1% more, if your company is operating on a global scale, or if your movie is being shown on a global scale, that could be worth another $100 million in revenue. So that obsession when you're operating on a global scale is the best explanation for the fact that starting in the 1980s, when global capitalism arose, and by the way, it's true of hedge fund managers, it's true across the lawyers, it's true across the board of skilled people, that they're being paid much more than the premiums are so great when global capitalism explodes. Because then the focus on talent and the focus on that extra increment of talent is obsessive. And we can be cynical about it. I am indeed cynical about so many of these explosive salaries, in particular this idea that this one person can make all the difference. But my God, we certainly believe that in the political sphere. We certainly believe that some star, some charismatic person can deliver us from evil. So that's really the explanation for the exploding CEO pay. Well, we've talked about Piketty's various ideas. Hopefully we've seen all of them lead to a dead end. Let me lead to the final howler. This again is probably a book that's going to win the Nobel Prize and certainly become iconic. This is something that, I write for Barron's, a financial newspaper, so I went after this especially. Let me read it in Piketty's book. Of course, a U.S. citizen at the median of the wealth distribution has only $100,000 to invest, so he must be his own money manager and probably has to rely on the advice of his brother-in-law. This is what Piketty writes. So what he's really talking about is ways in which rich people have such a huge advantage in the investment market. Because after all, the guy with only $100,000 only has his brother-in-law to advise him, according to Piketty. Whereas, to be sure, financial advisors and money managers are not infallible, to say the least, but their ability to identify more profitable investments is the main reason why the largest university endowments obtain the highest returns. I wrote, for the brother-in-law, the next slide. For the brother-in-law, total returns from an index fund with 30-year returns was 7.2%, The 20-year returns were 7.04%, and at least the smaller endowments made less than that. It's amazing that, again, that Piketty's book is so divorced from reality that he's never heard of the fact that there are index funds for the average person with only $1,000. The index funds have returned even more than the very actively managed endowments. It's actually a scandal that the hedge funds and so many of the actively managed funds do worse than the indexes, and anybody with $1,000 can get into the indexes. But Piketty lives in this fantasy, believing that the only person you can resort to is your brother-in-law if you have only $100,000. Again, sort of divorced from reality. I'm going to conclude. I'm sure I've probably exhausted you completely with these various ideas, but I'm going to conclude only with a quote from Paul Samuelson, another Nobel Prize winner, of Keynes's General Theory. That book, The General Theory. Paul Samuelson writes, "It is a badly written book." He writes about the General Theory by John Maynard Keynes. "Poorly organized. It abounds in mare's nests and confusions. In it, the Keynesian system stands out indistinctly, as if the author were hardly aware of its existence or cognizant of its properties. In short, it is a work of genius." That's Samuelson's notion about a work of genius, a book of this kind. I would say that the same statement applies to Piketty's book. It stands out as if the author were hardly aware of the existence or cognizance of its properties. It's a massive confusion of mare's nests and confusions, but it's clearly a book that the Nobel laureates want to expound upon. It's clearly a book that excites them. It's 700 pages long. First of all, we can rely on the fact that nobody's going to read it. We can rely on the fact that such books, of course, become iconic. They become, nobody reads them, but everybody believes what they say. Inequality is bad, capitalism is bad. Nobody wants to know what's in the book. I have now saved you all the trouble you might go to read the book, because I've quoted from the book, I've quoted from its core, and I recommend you try reading something else like the book I published. Thank you very much. I hope you have some questions, some challenges, some remarks, something or other to say. We'll start. Oh, this young man in front.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
I have two questions.
Oh,
questions to break
sure.
the ice, so to speak. First, if you can expand a bit, why do you think the book has such a tremendous success?
Yeah.
You could expand a bit on it.
Yeah.
And another question. What would you caution us when people speak about inequality? What to pay attention to? In my experience, usually those who speak about inequality usually use, as you said, slides of hand here and there. What would you caution students who read about inequality and stuff that might get them worried?
Yeah. Well, good questions, thank you. Well, I mean, because I think certainly with the benefit of hindsight, we could say with respect to the success of the book that you read a book called Capitalism in the 21st Century, and everybody knows it's about inequality. Capital in the 21st Century. First of all, of course, you're using a title that sounds a little bit like Karl Marx's Capitalism, and so you're clearly in that tradition. It helps that you're French, because it gives you a certain status in the world. You know, it's better to be French, say, than to be Romanian or to be American if you write that book. But in addition, of course, it came about at a time when the objections to inequality in the U.S. Became so rampant. And as Kurgman himself says, indeed, the reason why we are concerned about inequality is because it's happening in the U.S. And so this book then becomes, and of course you want to make sure that it's a doorstopper of a book, you know, the term doorstopper, make sure it can stop the door. 700 pages long, really long, forbidding. I, by the way, found it fairly readable, not badly done. It was not translated by Piketty. Piketty speaks English, but he didn't translate his own book. It's reasonably well written. It's not as totally obscure and meandering as Keynes's book is. But certainly, again, people, you can pretty much guarantee that if it's about economics, nobody's going to read it, but of course you keep it on your shelf, you pretend you've read it, just like, of course, Robert Solow's pretended he's read it. But, so therefore, it arrived at the right time. The society and the cultural gestalt was ripe for a book that was in the tradition of Karl Marx to argue and skewer capitalism for its inequality, and then to call it the 21st century when you're publishing the very early part of the 21st century. That's very nice, good packaging, because after all, you're taking in the entire century. So all of it, the time, the title, the origins, the translation, the weight of the book, all of it probably meant that if you were a publisher, you could say, we're going to make several $1 million from this book, as indeed turned out to be the case. So I think that's the reason why it's become so popular. And again, the thickness of the book and the forbidding nature of the book means that, as I've tried to demonstrate, you can say anything you want about what the book says. You can shoot off your mouth like Stiglitz does, that it's about phony capitalism. You can say anything you want about it. So it's the perfect book for our time. And of course, a rather depressing reflection on the intellectual quality of our Nobel laureates. Although, of course, I did quote from a Nobel laureate I respect, Friedrich Hayek, who did have sensible things to say about philosophy and about economics. Now, getting to the other very good question about what would you say about inequality? Well, from my perspective, it depends on my audience when we talk about it, but actually, the thing that I most emphasize whenever, 90% of the time when I talk to my progressive friends, who, of course, if you're going to have any friends living in Manhattan as I do, you're going to have a lot of progressive friends, because that's where a lot of them hang out. You do want to say that, two things, I think. That first of all, there's a lot of inequality that you object to. That's when I throw up that chart about the booms and the busts in the late 1920s, or in the recent period. There's a lot of, all the lawyers who make a fortune of money on figuring out how to get beyond the labyrinth of politics. All the people who bring these massive cases that are usually bogus, that sort of feed off the corruption of the legal system. All the banks and the banksters that get bailed out by government. The agribusiness, the sugar interests. There's so much money that pours. The TARP program was like $1 trillion. It was the TARP program meaning the money that the Federal Reserve printed. It all went to Wall Street. That's, by the way, that's why New York economy did pretty well in 08 and 09. After Baker said all that money went to Wall Street. It was taken from people. So we want to point out that the massive problem of inequality in this country is not so much that you object to the result, but you object to the process. You object that if you're going to earn your money, sell something to somebody, that you do respect capital stacks between consenting adults. You do respect, you have to respect the fact that Piketty made millions of dollars from his book, and people bought it voluntarily. That wasn't crony capitalism, that was clean capitalism, by which he sold this book that was without merit. Now, the third thing, of course, you want to say is that, again, you have no passion for these kinds of, getting Tom Cruise rich or getting, you use whatever example you want. The best example to my mind is Piketty himself, but state that it's not, that if somebody, what am I going to do? If somebody wants to look to that store and buy the product that's in that store, whatever it may be, perhaps a product that you disdain, Cinnabon at the airport or whatever else, and buy that product. How can you prevent that person from doing so? There's a very good, if you've heard of the book by Anarchy, State and Utopia by Robert Solow, at that time a libertarian philosopher, and he posited a case in which, let's say, we have a society in which everybody gets exactly the kind of income that we all would approve of. Whether it's equal or not equal, it's the just income. But let's say that he used the example of Wilt Chamberlain, who at that time was a very famous basketball player, a big star. And he said, well, let's say that Wilt Chamberlain decides to work in the evening and demonstrate his basketball prowess at Madison Square Garden and charge $1 a piece every single night. And Wilt Chamberlain makes a few $1 million a year in extra income from this. Now, we began with a situation in which the income distribution we just agreed and stipulated was the fair income distribution. But now people are using that income that they got fairly to go to see Wilt Chamberlain dribble the ball. So what are we going to do about that? Are we now going to send in the police to stop Wilt Chamberlain from putting on this show and earning millions of dollars in extra income? You and I might say, well, listen, it doesn't impress me, his basketball prowess. I would rather stay home and read a book. But am I going to stop those people from doing that? Stop those people? So my point is that what you should be is at least recognize that I'm just as cynical about income distribution. I'm cynical about people. People are crazy with the way they spend their money. But am I going to stand in their way and prevent them from making Tom Cruise rich? Or from buying the product of a corporation? Was preventing a corporation from paying a CEO a high salary? When I don't even buy that corporation's product, so it's not any money out of my pocket. So again, I guess the three things to say is that yes, you object to inequality in our society because so much of it is sponsored, at least I would say in terms of my personal economy, the economy that I live in the U.S., by the Federal Reserve and by government. So much of it is money channeled to the rich. Second, you object. You have no respect for the ways in which income is distributed necessarily because people do crazy things. I see a question, I think a challenge, a very good challenge coming at me. Go ahead, yes.
I have a question, maybe
Yeah.
you would like not to answer, I understand, because it's a rather personal one.
I would love to answer your question. Go ahead, yes.
I'm curious if you live for a year in another country. So for a whole year in another country. Have you had that experience?
No, I have not lived for a whole year in another country. If that's what you want to know?
Yes.
Well, could you elaborate on why my inadequacies in that? What would I learn if I lived in another country? Could you explain that to me? I'm sure I learned a lot.
I think it's interesting to have a different perspective, that when you have dollars that you try to change the perspective, or when you are I don't know, not necessarily about the mood.
Well, I will say. I'm sorry?
Just to have a different perspective.
I'm sure that's true. Well, I will say that I've traveled extensively to other countries. This is my second time in Romania. It certainly helped my perspective. I'm certainly fascinated to talk to people like you and other people I've met in Romania. I will say that I asked people in Romania, yesterday I did a presentation on what's called the Economic Freedom Index, which is a measure of the degree of capitalism in different countries. And what I found about the Economic Freedom Index with respect to Romania is that a crucial portion of it that's regarded as the most crucial, having to do with that's called legal system and property rights, was rated very low. And why was it rated low? It was rated low because it was based upon a survey of executives, of business people in Romania, who were asked a series of questions about their degree of property rights, that if you own property or you secure your property, about the fairness of the courts, about all of those things having to do with your legal rights. And it's been argued that that component is very bad in Romania. And it turns out that the CEOs all gave their own country a relatively low rating in terms of that. And so it certainly prompted concern on my part that if there were more property rights, more respect for property rights in Romania, then there would be more capitalism. If there were more capitalism, there would be more entrepreneurship. If there was more entrepreneurship, there'd be more economic opportunity. And if there's more economic opportunity, then people of limited means would do a lot better. You probably have more inequality, possibly have more inequality, but you'd also have many more people benefiting. So you're quite right that certainly living in a country also educates. And that's one of my inadequacies. I have not spent a whole year living in another country, absolutely. Any other questions, comments? Yes?
Do you think that the economy control the government, or the government control the economy?
Do I think the economy controls the government, or do I think the government controls the economy? Well, good question. I would say, I would put it more precisely and say that, that the progressive illusion is that when you have a more powerful government, a regulatory state, when the government has more control over the capitalist economy, and I'll talk about the capitalist economy specifically, we can forget socialism, outright socialism at the moment, then what inevitably happens, even from its infancy, is that entrenched business interests who don't want to be challenged by competition start taking control. When you look at the rise of regulation, regulatory bodies in the United States around the late 1800s, for example, you'll find that in fact, even at their inception, they were conceived of and run by big business. It's called, as a matter of fact, by another Nobel Prize winner, George Stiglitz, regulatory capture. That the regulators are captured by the regulated. And of course, it should be kind of what we say in America, a no-brainer. Why is it a no-brainer? The reason it's a no-brainer is because if you're in business, there are two ways to make money in the crony capitalist system. One is by selling a product that people want to buy. The other is by buying influence in Washington and taking over the regulator, keeping out competition, making it more and more difficult for people to compete with you. And so obviously, you want to do both. But sometimes it costs only 5 cents on the dollar to buy influence in Washington. Or think of it, in fact, if you look at the inception of the Federal Reserve, the central bank in the United States, it was basically conceived of by a whole lot of bankers in collusion with other politicians. The interesting history there is that they resisted at times the idea of a central bank. But once the idea of a central bank became a viable idea and looked as though it was going to happen politically, then there was a meeting on actually a place called Jekyll Island off the coast of South Carolina. And that's where they met, and that's where they just formulated in conjunction with politicians how the Federal Reserve would work in order to make the established banks more powerful. So my point is that it's very clear that by and large, this state is in the hands of just agribusiness. It's in the hands of the capitalists to the extent that you make the state powerful, because they will clearly see. Goldman Sachs, a firm you may have heard of, has been jokingly called government Sachs, because so many of the people who work for Goldman Sachs work to start running the U.S. Treasury. These are their friends on Wall Street, of course, and so of course they run in the interest of their friends. Of course, the money goes to Wall Street. Now, the other point that Milton Friedman and others have made is that you and I can fight the sugar interests. We can fight all these special interest groups that organize and build government. We can fight the crony capitalist system, but it's a hydra-headed monster. If we defeat one part of it, there's not enough hours in the day to defeat the other 19 parts of it. Because these are special interests that are able to coalesce and spend all their time and effort building government, and in order to expose this corruption and make people aware of it, there's not enough hours in the day to fight even one or two of them. I believe is a military-industrial complex. When the U.S. starts spending money on war, then eventually we have companies that benefit from this. We had Dick Cheney Dick Cheney had been Vice President of the United States. He had been Secretary of Defense. And so he left the Defense Department, and he's suddenly hired as a chief executive officer in a corporation. What experience did this man have running a corporation? Well, I would have hired him. Why? Because he became chief executive officer of a company called Halliburton that sold to the Pentagon, that sold to the military. So of course you're going to hire him. He's the guy who can boost sales for your company. So of course you hire him. The man had no business qualifications. Similar, by the way, with the housing bubble. The housing bubble, which, by the way, was a housing bubble in the United States, which was essentially brought about by government. You had people who were basically selling mortgages to the government. A guy named Angelo Mazzillo, who was CEO of Countrywide, a company called Countrywide. if you actually listen to this man's lecture, this man, Angelo Mazzillo, won an award at Harvard University, this housing division of Harvard. And in 2003, he delivered a lecture about mortgages for the poor. And he literally said that our mortgages, he said that 4/5 of the people who get our mortgages are able to pay on those mortgages. And he said this at Harvard. In other words, he was saying there's a 20% default rate on our mortgages. Now, if you have a 20% default rate on your mortgages, you better charge a very high interest rate. But nobody pointed out to him that there's some problem there. How can you possibly make any money from these mortgages if it's a 20% default rate? Well, Angelo Mazzillo didn't know anything about mortgages. He was selling all those mortgages basically to the government. So I'm running away with examples. But what I'm trying to say, though, that if you make the government powerful, the powerful capitalist interests will come. In fact, they'll be there almost at the inception. So there are exceptions there. There are other issues. There are other ways in which bureaucrats, of course, do our hard on slow business. There's other things that are true about our system that are bad. But what I'm saying is that it's a first approximation, the colossal naivete of those who think that a more powerful government, Bernie Sanders, a very admirable person. People say I look like him. People say I sound like him. I'm very flattered. I'm just almost his age. Bernie Sanders is a socialist, and he wants a more powerful government. And he dreams that this more powerful government is going to bring about good things. Well, Wall Street, the powerful business interests will be plenty interested in what he has to say. They'll shape. They have all the time and all the effort to make sure that things go their way. He's no threat to them. He's basically alive to them. So the only hope is that people wake up to this and recognize that the only defense we have against such a system is limited government. The only defense we have is a constitution that says the government can do certain things and not others. That's the only possibility that we have to protect ourselves against crony capitalism. Now, one final answer, I hasten to add that I'm not that much of a cynic in this sense. I do believe that the American economy is not primarily crony capitalist. I do believe that by and large it still is on balance a capitalist system. I do believe that it has by and large delivered, even over the last 30 years, and that's been questioned, but even over the last 30 years, or the last 15 years especially, when crony capitalism I think has become especially virulent, I believe that by and large it's delivered a better material condition for the broad masses of people. And that, in my mind, the fact that people are better off than they were 20, 30 years ago, even the average person, the average household is better off. They have access to products. I'm inspired, of course, obviously by Facebook, by Google, by all of the entrepreneurs who are still operating in our system, who are still delivering wonderful things to us. And so it's not as though the crony capitalists win all the time. But certainly, we would do far better if we recognize that government in a capitalist system can never be on the side of the ordinary people. It's by and large going to be, obviously, it's a no-brainer, it's going to be on the side of those people who have the time and money to buy the influence. A long-winded answer to a very good question. Thank you. Anyway. Yes?
I would have a suggestion more than a question.
Oh, a suggestion.
I saw that you said numerous times that Piketty's book was bought by a lot of people but read by none because they didn't pass page 26. Maybe this is not the best index to measure the value of the book. I saw that you quoted extensively on Hayek also had books that were not read at all. For example, his Pure Theory of Capital, one of the books he considered one of his best, sold almost no copies. There are sources which say that maybe there are 10 people in the world who read the book. Even Milton Friedman, which I understand was not maybe his friend, his acquaintance, says that it was the worst book ever read. But maybe that's not true. Maybe this is not the best indicator to gauge the value.
Well, I accept the correction completely from a scholar such as yourself. Did you read Hayek's book?
Yes.
I haven't. I haven't read that book, although I'm aware of it. Of course, the only difference, of course, is that Piketty's book was very little read, and he still made millions of dollars from that. But since it has sold in millions of copies in many translations, Hayek wasn't so lucky. Nobody read it, nobody bought it. Maybe 10 people read it and 6 people bought it. So that's a difference. But I do accept the correction. Not every book that goes unread is unworthy. That's for sure. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yes.
First, I want to thank you for bringing a word in that everybody is confused about in Romania. I had the American experience that in Romania, the word progressive. Thanks God for the word progressive, because until now the left was more liberal, which confused everybody. As in Romania, what liberal is considered to be in the whole Europe, not in Romania, a part of a right policy. So they changed land to progressive, no more confusion. But what I want to ask you, if my understanding is right, and please correct me if I think that by Piketty, by doing that, it's not keeping the eye on the ball. To me, the ball essentially is the growth of an economy. Now, the growth of the economy, and here you have two choices. Sounds strange and too simple. Okay, one choice is to have an entrepreneurial, in which eventually you're going to have inequality. But as Kennedy, a Democrat, no love lost for the conservative, but he came with a quote that was used by conservatives all the time. When the tide rises, all the boats ride with it. The little ones and the big ones. So what you need, once again, economic growth. So if you want to look for anything else, you don't keep the eye on the ball, as I say. Number two, that's one alternative. The other one is to follow this inequality. Now, mostly when you do follow the inequality, one of the first way to do it is taxation. You take the money from the rich and you start social programs. You stay and say, wonderful, isn't that great that we spread the wealth around? Not necessarily. By doing so, you take money from the people that usually invest. By investing, they make the economy grow. So when you basically do that, you stop the growth of the economy. The result is, what we have in the United States. We have 1.7, growth, which is, and cannot make up for this growth that will spread around for everybody else. So I'm done at this stage, but I want to say, remember, the most important thing, it's not how much money Bill Gates makes, how much money you make.
Well, I want to pick up at that point and say, again, we've covered a whole range of issues, but I do want to say that another question that always arises when I speak to progressives is the idea of taking care of the poor. And I have to say that I try to short-circuit the discussion by saying is that, look, if you want, Milton Friedman didn't think the negative income tax, as he called it, was the ideal solution, but he did propose it. A negative income tax, of course, means that instead of you paying taxes, you get paid by the government. You file a certain income, and if it's below a certain level, then on a graduated basis, you get money. And I say that I don't think that's the ideal solution to poverty. I could talk about it, that would be a whole lecture, a whole discussion. But I will say that I try to short-circuit it with people and say that, look, if you want a negative income tax, if you want an income floor, then there are libertarians that propose that. It's not as though you can't be a libertarian, you can't be a limited government person and say, well, I do want income distribution. But then you would say that, look, if you allow capitalism, however, if that's what you want, but if you allow capitalism to operate, and if you have decent work incentives, then eventually, in fact, very quickly, really, nobody's going to need that negative income tax, because the best way to get out of poverty is to work. And if you work, if you have a job, if you learn on the job, that's how you enhance your human capital. And very quickly, in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, allow the free market to operate. And even the very poorest will be rich by the standards of today. There too, now I would say, if you actually look at the income distribution programs in the United States, I think it's created more problems than it solves. I think it's kept people in poverty. Many things you could say about it are a real problem. However, again, if you want to short circuit the discussion, yes, you are compassionate about the poor. Although you could also say the real poor people of the world, of course, are the people who live on less than $1 a day. Not the poor people in Romania, even in a poorer country, and certainly not the poorer people in the United States. Those are the people you care about. And by the way, when you do have distribution schemes, then you have economies like Sweden and Norway that tend to keep out foreigners, because when foreigners come, then they too become stakeholders in the welfare state, and eventually those people are expelled. My ancestors came to the United States in 1910 at a time when there was no welfare. They came because they could work, because they could start businesses. That's how they got into this country. Try getting into the United States now, far more difficult to do so, and I believe that it's partly because of the welfare state, partly because obviously people come to a neighborhood just more, even specifically, they start objecting that they're going to get food stamps. These are foreigners. They're taking our money. Well, less objection if they work, if they have businesses, if they actually produce for you. But that's the problem with the welfare state. But then going back to it, however, you want to say a negative income tax for the poor, sure. An income floor for the poor, but keep work incentives in place. Because eventually, those poor people, if they have a job, if they work, they're not going to need any money. And then we'll have such a tiny percentage of indigents, such a tiny percentage of people who will really need help in the society. That charity, by the way, if you look at what philanthropy has done, and will more than take care of those people. But keep the negative income tax if you want it for those handful that remain. That's also, I think, what you should say. Well, I'm sure that I've went out my way. Do you want the final word?
Only a follow-up. I want to know who the real Gene Epstein is. Let's play the cards at the same time. I'd like to know which politicians, and today, would you like him to be a candidate that would be close to your...
Well, not Donald Trump.
In the US.
In the US, yeah, I only know the US. I don't know your candidate. Not Donald Trump, for reasons I understand. Even though I like something that a few things that Donald says about the Iraqi war, I think he does. But on the other side, he wants soldiers. He's a little bit nuts. Not Hillary Clinton. So those two not. But actually, a candidate you haven't heard of, a man named Gary Johnson, who is actually running on the Libertarian Party platform. I would have supported another candidate you may have heard of called Ron Paul. Ron Paul, by the way, spoke about Social Security and other benefits, that sort. He basically understood, obviously, that if you have a welfare state and you have made commitments to poor people, you have to keep those commitments, but you want to grow the economy so that everybody can become richer. So Gary Johnson, certainly, and I only wish Ron Paul, who is now 81 years old, were young enough to continue to run, since he was by far the most inspiring candidate. He was running several years ago, but certainly Gary Johnson, Libertarian Party, if you could possibly come to America and sneak into a voting booth and vote for him, and I invite you to do so. Anyway, thank you very much for your time.